use as much time as we can for the class. Welcome to the Open Classroom. How many of you have been here before? How many are here for the very first time? Oh, wonderful. Welcome to the Open Classroom.
Amplification.
Isn't that working?
No.
All right,
Now
I'll
it
lean
is.
into it. Okay, better?
Yes.
Can hear me well now. So as those of you who are here for the first 2 weeks, you know, we started out with an introduction to this course, the role of government in the 21st century, and we were graced with an introduction by our friend Bob Kuttner, Robert Kuttner, award-winning journalist, co-editor of American Prospect, and a regular presence on the Huffington Post. And then you'll remember, if you were here last week, we really had a journey through Hollywood. We looked at about 35 minutes of wonderful film clips from 1913, Traffic in Souls, and 1915, Birth of a Nation, all the way through to Bulworth in 1998, and asked the question, how do we get to a point where we have our understanding of government, and does Hollywood influence our vision of government, or does our vision of government that we all have influence Hollywood? As you know, we have a real graduate seminar that is connected with this course, and we meet the graduate students who are registered for credit, writing papers and so forth, meet just before this class for an hour or so. And we got into a wonderful conversation about why is it that this time around, in the midst of a great recession that seems to be continuing unabated, why has there been such anger? Why has there been so much anger, particularly addressed to government? And two things came out of that conversation from my students. These aren't my ideas, these are graduate students who came up with two, I think, very interesting things that we might want to think about both tonight and throughout the course. And one is that in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, and the New Deal of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, you certainly had people who were violently anti-government, particularly corporate leaders, but you had massive support for Roosevelt, who was bringing all of these new programs of the New Deal, from the Works Progress Administration to the Civilian Conservation Corps to Social Security in 1935, the Wagner Act, which essentially led to the growth of trade unions all over the country, the federal standards for wages, the first minimum wage, you name it, we had it then, and there was great support for it. This time we seem to have a violent reaction, at least from among many citizens, and we see it in some of the Republican Party debates, taking cracks at government whenever they can. Where does that come from? Well, one person suggested that back in the 1920s and early 30s, at least the federal government was smaller than it is today. It did very little, it did very few things compared with what it does today. We didn't have Medicaid, we didn't have Medicare, we didn't have Social Security, and so forth. And the result was that there was less of government to be angry at, relative to today, where government is about 25% of gross domestic product. The other one that's very interesting had to do with the media. And it reminded me of a wonderful talk given by a friend of mine who teaches at Harvard University named Robert Putnam, who wrote a famous book about 15 or 20 years ago called Bowling Alone, in which he, those of you who may be familiar with the book, kind of looked at all of the voluntary organizations across the country and saw a decline in membership. Boys and Girls Clubs, the Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts, church attendance, people being active in their union, you name it. And he was trying to figure out what that was all about. Well, he told the story. The two of us were invited to speak before, I think it was the MacArthur Foundation, at a conference of their board of directors. And I had just finished a book, actually on inequality. And we were both invited out, and he told this wonderful story that I thought really suggested something about where we are today. If you go back and think about entertainment, Hollywood last night, and you go back to the 18th century, early 19th century, particularly in the West or the Midwest, much of the entertainment would be around, for instance, around a barn raising. A whole town coming together, put up a barn, and after the barn is up, there'd be a big party in which there'd be a fiddler and probably a banjo player, and they would do square dancing. And everybody in town would participate in the square dancing. All the men, all the women, the grandmothers, the grandfathers, the children. And if you think about square dancing, everybody is doing exactly the same thing. They're all doing it with other people who are neighbors and friends. And in fact, if you've ever done square dancing, I actually had a couple students who have never done it. You actually not only dance with your partner, you dance with everybody else. Do-si-do, out to your partner, etc. That then morphs into vaudeville in the late 19th and early 20th century. Still people are together in an auditorium like that, and there's live entertainment up here, right? But people are still together. That morphs into the first movies. 1915, Birth of a Nation. We're all in the theater together, but we're not watching real people. We're watching stuff on film. That morphs after World War II into television. Now we don't have to go to the theater. We can watch television, and we can watch 4 channels. And we watch our news, and for those of you in the audience who may remember, like I do, you watched Walter Cronkite, or you watched Chet Huntley and David Brinkley, you watched Edward R. Murrow, right? They brought you the news. They were the ones presenting the news, often in a fairly neutral way. You only had 4 stations. In Detroit, where I grew up, we had Channel 2, Channel 4, Channel 7, and Channel 9, which gave us foreign news from Windsor, Ontario, across the Great River. Then we move into the internet and the computer age. And so you'll have a family of 3, for example, my wife, my son before he went off to college, and myself, all sitting at our laptops doing different things 10 feet apart. But we also got cable television, right? Which meant we now have 800 cable stations, and instead of NBC, CBS, and ABC, we have Fox News, we have MSNBC, we've got all of these stations. And what does that mean? Like the internet, sitting around, every one of us can get entertained in specifically what we want. The square dance, you all participate in the square dance. Whether you really love square dancing or you just liked it a little bit, you were all there. Or vaudeville, or the movies. I don't like this movie, but let's go anyway. Now, everyone can have exactly the entertainment they want. So my son is watching soccer, I'm checking the New York Times, and my wife is watching the food channel. She's a very good cook. She's also a very good academic, but she loves the food channel. So we now have the opportunity of everybody having individualized information. But to the extent that people tune into those things that simply reinforce their biases, we get that kind of polarization. We get that people, some are watching O'Reilly and are watching Russ Limbaugh, and others of us are watching Rachel Maddow and Jon Stewart. And that might start to explain it pretty fast. Well, tonight, we're going to do something I think we've never done before. We have a live philosopher. We've had scientists, we've had economists, we've had film buffs, we've had theater directors, we've had musicians, and now we have a philosopher. Now, I'm particularly interested in this because I was telling our dear friend and my colleague that I have been just infused with philosophy this week because this past weekend I was up in Vermont with my wife for our niece's wedding. And we were in this absolutely gorgeous place. The weather cooperated. We're standing outside the lake, and my niece and her beau are getting married. It was a typical wedding. The new husband comes in a Captain Kirk Star Trek. Right? My niece, who has a lovely voice, sings her vows to a song she's made up and plays the guitar. But the best part of it is that Julia, my niece, decided to ask her brother, my dear nephew, Noah, to be the presiding minister for the day. Noah did his high school at Newton North. He went on to Vassar, and he is now completing a PhD on Plato in the philosophy department at the University of Chicago. So after we meet the bride and we meet Star Trek, we listen to Noah, who kind of explains what this wedding is all about. In terms of Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Sartre, and several other philosophers. What was fascinating was this went over everyone's head. Right? But it was fascinating to hear somebody talking about what does love really mean from the point of view of Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. Well, tonight, we are blessed with having my friend Steve Nathanson. I should tell you, he's more than a wonderful colleague. We actually taught a course together here, where we brought an economist and a philosopher together, which was a little bit like, once in a while, Saturday Night Live with Dan Aykroyd and Jane Curtin, Bluestone, you ignorant slut, that's all about money, right? What really counts is this. But Steve is going to be talking about markets, government, and economic justice. He's taught courses for a long time here at Northeastern in ethics and political philosophy. He's looked at the ethics of war. He's looked at patriotism. He's an expert on the death penalty. And he's written a large number of books, from his 1985 book on the ideal of rationality to his 2010 book, Terrorism and the Ethics of War. The book that I have enjoyed so much is one in which he has actually put together my field and his, this book called Economic Justice, which was published in 1998 by Prentice Hall. It's one of my favorite books of all time, and I commend it to you. I'm sure it's available on Amazon, and you should get a copy of it. Without further ado, Professor Stephen Nathanson on markets, government, and economic justice.